Now I'd like to turn the floor over to Kevin Phelan, my good friend, and been with the kin for 3 or 4 years now, right? A little bit more, right? So maybe, yeah. So he lives here, but as you might guess, he's not a native. And Kevin is going to walk us through a journey in the area of sport. There'll be a lot of the fun sports stuff. But what is the role of sport to change the world? Before I turn it over to Kevin, I want to mention the student team, the 2 student teams that worked on Craig's challenges. Their challenge was to come up with new-to-the-world things that people haven't seen before in the world of sports, to engage fans, to engage people around the world. And they each said something really simple but also challenging. What is the role of new technologies and how do we apply them, 3D printing in the space of sport? And for instance, and what is the role of new companies? How do we look at some of these new rising companies like Lyft, for instance? One of their ideas, I'll just share one, was to partner with Lyft drivers and give them sports jerseys for the Hawks or the Warriors to wear on rides to bring fans to the stadium and some sort of award to have a free limo ride, for instance, to the stadium, all tricked out for the Hawks. Things like this. This is just one. So they were really exciting, and I'm sure Craig will mention something about it. With that, my good friend, colleague, fellow Kinian through and through, Kevin Phelan.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
In the true nature of sport, of course, we've got the shot clock here, so it keeps changing. I don't know, we've had 45, and so if we suddenly stop, you'll know that the shot clock has finished. Sport, for me, I was kind of reflecting on the journey of sport and this whole sense of growth for good. And if you think about maybe the origins of what we might think of modern sport, go back to Greek times and Olympia and this whole sense of sport and coming together. And then you fast forward to today and what is clearly one of the world's biggest industries. It's truly a global business that is a connector of fans, it's a connector of communities, it's a core of many national identities, and for some it's almost a religion. And so it got me thinking about the power of sport in the wider world, and in some ways links very much with the conversations that we heard this morning from Professor Kotler, the whole 3 Ps, people, planet, profit, and how does sport play into that? We now know that CID greater than 1 is all we need to know. It's fantastic. I like that. But I also therefore got to think about sport in that context. The whole connection, the whole infection, the whole way in which we can create connection for good or for bad. I then reflected on the fact that there's a single event that takes place every 4 years. There's some issues around it at the moment called the World Cup. We did have a 4th panelist. The empty chair is in honor of our FIFA guest. No, I shouldn't say that. They'll be here in a few years once they get out. But every 4 years, there's a 90-minute event that essentially has 1/10 of the world's entire population watching it. 1/10 of the entire world's population watching it. I then looked at the value of the top 10 franchises, global sports franchises around the world. And the shocking thing to me was that the combined value of those 10 franchises was actually greater than the GDP of half the world's nations. So if sport has an influence beyond the game, as the title goes, I think that leads us to have some thought about the different perspectives. So to do that, we've got 3 unbelievably influential and knowledgeable people in the world of sport. We've got Nzinga Shaw, who is the Chief Diversity Officer for the Atlanta Hawks, recent Eastern Conference finalists, unfortunately lost out to the Cleveland Cavaliers. Boo. We have Craig Howe, who leads Rebel Ventures, which took me back to my Star Wars years. I was thinking like Luke Skywalker and the Rebel Army and all that good stuff, who really looks across the the globe from in terms of sports marketing and digital marketing and the power of influence. And a good friend of mine, Chris Waddell, who is a 13 times Paralympic medalist and a ski racer, as well as the founder of a fantastic foundation called One Revolution that I think is truly changing the way in which people can look at the world. So I'm actually going to ask the panelists to share a little bit about themselves, and then importantly give their perspective as we go through this first part on how one area in which they see sports' ability to really influence the wider world around us, and we'll kind of get into that, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation together. So I thought we'd start with Nzinga at the end.
Thank you so much for having me. I am the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the Atlanta Hawks in Phillips Arena, and this is the second time in my career that I have led the diversity and inclusion function at an organization. And so I operate in the white space. A lot of my job is creating a path forward for our organization and really defining what diversity and inclusion means in sports and how we utilize it to leverage everyone's best abilities and unique attributes so that we can get the most high-performing team that we can possibly make. And so I became uniquely aware of diversity and inclusion when I was working at the National Football League. We had a situation where we were going to pitch Pepsi to be a sponsor for a really long-term deal, and we ended up sending 10 people on the pitch, and they all happened to be male, they all happened to be white, and they all happened to be straight. And so, you know,
that looked like the rest of the world.
Oh, it just looked like the world, right? So we go to Pepsi, this global organization with this, great team of people, and we began to realize that we did not have all of the insights, or we weren't even able to display our knowledge of being a global organization because we weren't representative of what the world looked like. And so Indra Nooyi, who was leading Pepsi at the time, told us that she was not going to be able to secure this partnership because we weren't able to demonstrate that we had a depth of knowledge of what was happening in the world just based on the people that we sent. And then, of course, everyone comes back home and we say, wow, we have a really huge aha moment. What are we going to do with it? So we formed a diversity council. A lot of work began to spark from that. But that was really my first experience understanding how diversity can impact reputation, how it can impact the bottom line, and why we need to be having this conversation on a continual basis in organizations.
Wow, that's an amazing story in terms of a point of change. Thanks for that. Craig.
Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. I can't see anything, so I'm just going to start talking.
Unfortunately, they can see you though. So.
No, it's okay. I'm not shy, I don't think. So I sometimes feel like I'm 105 years old working in digital. I'll tell you my career very quickly in 3 phases. I was a brand marketer for about a decade. I worked in the video game space for a long time for Electronic Arts. My last corporate job, I was one of the heads of marketing for Universal Interactive. So marketing video games based on films, which was really interesting. Back in 1999, we had this really great insight that you could spend millions of dollars on print ads and billboards and TV, but the little tiny bit of money we were spending on chat rooms and forums and Friendster and MySpace to get nerds to talk about buying video games was a lot more effective. So in 2002, I started a social media agency. Didn't really know what I was doing, never had my own business, but we were one of the first in the right place at the right time. So I scaled that, LA, New York, Toronto, and London with a development studio in Stockholm. We had amazing clients, Unilever, Samsung, IKEA, Cliff Bar. We did some work for the United Nations. My favorite client, as a CEO, I spent all my time with the National Hockey League, which was like 3% of our revenue, but 90% of my time. And I realized that that's not healthy and that's not a good way to run a business. So I sold the agency and I took some time off and thought about what I love. And I love sports and technology. So initially I started consulting and I called my mentor, who's Bob Bowman. I don't know if you guys know him. He's the president and CEO of Major League Baseball Advanced Media. The reason he's my mentor is because Major League Baseball Advanced Media makes less than 50% of its revenue from baseball. They're basically a technology company that was built off the back of baseball. And that really triggered something in me. And my passion is about, digital is actually a valuable medium and it's only going to get bigger. So I consulted for him and then I ran social media strategy and created for the NFL for a couple of years. And it was the club sites division, so it's all 32 teams. And I said, guys, I can't do this job from an office in Culver City, California, when I don't know what it's like to work for a team. So I worked for the 49ers and the Broncos, actually doing the job of what, Zing and people do at the team every day. And I got very passionate about these people and the fact that when you work in sports for a team, you don't get paid a ton of money because everyone wants your job, and you work unbelievably long hours all around the performance of the team and doing everything you can to help the team. So my passion, my cause, Rebel Ventures as a company, we want to transform sports entities, particularly sports teams, into new media empires. So we work with 6 of the top 30 of your list. I love that you mentioned that list. Real Madrid, Chicago Bulls, Liverpool, Wimbledon, Golden State Warriors, San Francisco 49ers. We work with about 14 different sports organizations, helping them to envision the world of digital and maximize content to increase value. And then the other side of our business, we do tech ventures, so we invest in technology companies that can power that ideal and that vision. So one of ours was Snappy TV, that's now Twitter Amplified Video. Sorry if I'm getting too nerdy, but I'll stop. So I'm the digital guy in the middle.
Essentially the guy that's taking all of the stuff that happens in one place and making sure that everyone around the world can see it and be part of it.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's the goal.
That's the goal. Chris?
Which seems like a great segue for me in some ways. The power of sport to me became different in that I joined a group that I had no desire to join. About 27 years ago, had a skiing accident, became paralyzed, and saw that the importance of sport to me was that it was a bond. So as a skier, I share the same mountain that you do. As I'm going up, you're coming down. As you're going up, I'm coming down, and we watch each other. And I've had so many people come up to me and say, oh, you're better on that than I am on 2 skis. To which I often say, yes, I know. But part of that is that it's amount of time. I mean, I've often skied more during the summer than most people ski during the winter. My organization, as Kevin said, One Revolution, our mission is to turn perception of disability upside down. According to WHO, there are 1.1 billion people in the world with physical disabilities. Like 1 in 6, 1 in 7 people. It's a huge part, but it's an invisible part of the population. From the time we're little, we're taught not to stare at somebody who looks different. And sport is a way to get to stare. Sport is a way to share a common experience and to see what we're doing as individuals. Now, the greatest thing, my greatest achievement, I think, in sport, this will make sense, I hope, was that I was in People magazine. Doesn't make any sense at all, right? I was one of the 50 most beautiful people in People magazine. It did more for my ability to make a living in sport than all of the medals that I won at any other time. So it really is about being able to tell the story. And the story, our motto is, it's not what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens to you. And the intention behind that is that it's universal. That applies to you as much as it applies to me. It's the same common experience. And the thing about what we're looking at with this common experience is that none of us want to be told what to do. Right? How can we affect change? How can we use sport as change? None of us want to be told what to do, but yet if we make it personal, then we can find a way to affect the change. And sport, to me, is the most personal thing. The greatest compliment I ever received in sport, I was living in Vail at the time, and I was training, and the men's pro tour came into town. My former coach had been a World Cup skier, and a bunch of these guys who were racing pro at that time had been World Cup skiers, so a bunch of them were training with us. And I'm waiting for my turn to go, and there's a Swedish guy behind me waiting for his turn to go after me, and he said to me, I like your turns. And I was like, well, I like your turns too. But the thing about it was that we were sharing that same thing, that he was appreciating me for who I was, not necessarily for like, oh, it's great that you're out here. It's like, no, it's great that you've devoted yourself into being, as a skier, as you talk about, it's sort of like this magical journey, for the unicorn, for the perfect turn. The Holy Grail is the perfect, it doesn't really exist, but we're all searching for it. And that's what he appreciated, and that's what I appreciated in him. So
that's great. I think it sparks in me a question here about the power of sport to help change stereotypes or to continue to reinforce stereotypes? And we see a lot of this in the press quite often. You know, oh, players are like this, sports people are like that, or whatever. Nzinga, from your perspective, how do you see sports' ability to actually influence and change commonly held stereotypes? Do you think sport really has a role in that?
Absolutely. I mean, you look at how many people in this world consume sport on a day-to-day basis, right? Sports are valuable in that you can bring together a variety of people from various socioeconomic backgrounds or religions or races, and they're all rallying together to support this one entity. And so what we see happen play on the field, or what we see athletes promote off the field, can oftentimes push an agenda that is greater than that game that we just consumed. And so I think that athletes really need to recognize the power that they have. They need to embrace the fact that beyond being an athlete, they're also change agents of social concern. We've seen it play out in the media on several occasions. I think it will continue to play out. You look at someone like a Jason Collins, who recently came out as the first openly gay athlete in the NBA. And then you see all of these different athletes in the NBA rally and support around him. Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, everyone reached out and wrapped their arms around his ability to be open and honest about his lifestyle and say that this is just a facet of my life, but this doesn't impact my ability to be good on the field or bad on the field or whatever I bring to the sport. And so I think that you know, we will begin to see more and more stories like that come out. We saw Bruce Jenner, who recently came out as a transgender person. And so I think that absolutely sports is critical and can certainly start a movement of positive social change.
And Craig, you know, you live in the world of media, which is all about sort of money and image and everything like that. How do you see that world kind of changing and embracing positively this from a sport perspective?
Well, I'll just be very blunt and real with my answer. I think there's an inherent problem, and it has nothing to do with the athletes. I mean, there's some cases where there's things that do have to do with the athletes, but if you look at sports media right now, how many of you guys, you see what happens on Wednesday? I just noted it was 5.5 hours straight of FIFA coverage on SportsCenter, right? To me, Twitter has become TMZ for sports media, right? They scour it every day. ESPN wants to throw any tweet on air that's going to negatively damage or scour or disparage an athlete or a team or a brand. And aside from that, everyone is scrambling to own rights, right? So at its purest, sports is just great content, right? There's so many great moments that happen in training, at live events, things behind the scenes. But there's so much time being spent on fighting for who owns those rights. And then, you know, any type of negativity is so overblown in the world of media that we're missing a lot of great content. We were talking about that at breakfast this morning. Chris goes, you know, I love the world of digital content, but I don't really get enough of it. Well, the reason why you don't get enough of it is because people are either really nervous that something negative might happen, or they're fighting over rights of who owns the great content. So I think sports can do a lot more if there's a little bit of change in those two areas.
And you know, Chris, from a Paralympic perspective, I know we've seen quite a movement forward in the last few years in terms of a much higher profile within the Games. And I think it was the Commonwealth Games last year, which was the first time that a major global sporting event actually integrated both Paralympic and regular sport events. How do you see the use of media, or again, the ability of sport to actually start to create a melding of those two worlds, and you know, the sort of world of Craig and media to help support that?
The melding of the two worlds, I hope, I mean, in some ways it does. I mean, to your point, yes, that was a major sporting event, but you also have like the Boston Marathon and things like that, where it's been going on for a long time. And it is beautiful to be able to share that same space. And the Paralympics have been in the same venues as the Olympics since Seoul in 1988, I believe. And so that's been a long time. But some of it is kind of calling attention to the viability of Paralympic sport. And I think that's one of the things that is surprising. So like Jean Driscoll was here earlier this week, and I don't know if anybody noticed, but she did say how fast she had gone at the Boston Marathon. 1 hour, 34 minutes, which You know, if you think about that, that's a little bit faster than most of the runners are going. You know, the world record for men is 1 hour, 18 minutes, and 22 seconds, I think. So, which is like an average of 3-minute miles. That little Roger Bannister did that thing where he was worried about his heart and lungs exploding, 4-minute mile, one of them. This is 3 for 26.2. You know, and I think that some of it is this marriage of the media and being able to tell that story, but it's also finding an avenue into that story where the story is about the individual. It's not reinforcing the differences. Sometimes we want to look at it and we want to look at why is this different. And I think that ultimately the reason we come to sport is because those of us sitting on our couch can share in the victory that we see on the television because we're human beings. And ultimately, I think that's the prism through which we have to look at it, is how can we display it in a way that it's about us? Because you know what? The fact of the matter is the vast majority of us, the vast majority of our children will not be Olympic or professional athletes. It really is the case. But yet on the Paralympic side, I think that we can look at it because every one of us, no matter who we are, is struggling here on some level. And we learn something from somebody else's struggle to be able to put ourselves in the position of the protagonist, which sports most assuredly has protagonists, and try to figure out how we can do that. And I think that that's where the melding comes in, is realizing that it's a shared experience.
Yeah, it's you know, sport has such a great ability to ultimately draw people together, both the participants and the wider world. One of the things that I was reading recently, so you know, the United States on the Olympic front is bidding for the 2024 Summer Games, and you mentioned Boston because that's going to be the bid city, but Boston's not sure if it wants it. Oslo was going to take the Winter Games, and the good folk of Oslo said, well, we don't want this thing. Leads me to think about the power of sport to connect with cities and communities and help with economic development and drive that integration. Because there you've got really a citizenry saying, actually, we don't think this is a good trade-off for us. We're not willing to take the tax risk. We're not willing to kind of take the downside for the promise of maybe something good. Craig, you work with a lot of people around the world. How do you see the power of sport to help really local communities and cities?
Well, I think digital has completely changed the paradigm of what it means to be local, right? I'll give you guys a couple of stats. Real Madrid is the biggest digital sports franchise in the world. Only 3% of their global digital and social fan base lives in Madrid. The Chicago Bulls, 22 million fans, only 4% of those live in Chicago. So when you look at where these fans actually exist and where you're propagating your content into the digital universe. I had a great quote at the Instagram Sports Summit several months ago. They said, you want to activate locally but think globally, you know, because I think that I'm not so sure, just to be blunt with you, you know, all the logistics of owning and spending all that money to have something that you're rallying a city around really. When you look at the Olympics, it's not about Boston, it's about the country, right? It's about getting Americans and people around the world just getting excited for that time of the Olympics. So to me, I think it's always thinking globally and building a global brand, and that's the power of digital and the monetization of digital once you build it to scale. And that's what, you know, I'm so passionately doing every day of my life is how do you bring revenue to that global digital scale and how do you create it?
Yeah, that's cool. Nzinga, I know we spoke earlier about Atlanta and some, you know, challenges for the city and obviously the success of your team. Your reflections on a city-based franchise and its ability to actually create change in the community?
Absolutely. I mean, when I started at the Atlanta Hawks, we were in a very stressful time. We had just gone through something very public in the media where our controlling owner and our general manager were outed for making very race-related comments regarding the African American community and why they did not want to continue to engage this community as fans of the Atlanta Hawks. And so we saw that play out in the media, coupled with the fact that we live in Georgia, which is a very conservative state. It's the home of civil rights. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. We have a lot of civil rights activists there, and so the racial tension in the city was at an all-time high. And so, you know, the Atlanta Hawks during this time, the team, we don't have a star, we don't have a franchise player, but we have a bunch of guys that really act as teammates and really share the ball. No pun intended, but they just really behave that way. And so we started to see them rally together and rise above everything that was happening in the local community to win games. And they started winning more and more games, more than ever before. We ended up leading the Eastern Conference as the #1 seed going into the playoffs, et cetera. And what we began to see was people in the local community get excited about this win because it was something positive that we could all wrap our arms around in the midst of this storm that we were going through. And so we began to engage with new communities. We had never really engaged with the Hispanic community in the past, although there are 1.2 million Hispanics in Atlanta. So we start to send team members out into these communities and start to educate young students about the game of basketball and how they can become a part of it. The next thing you know, you're looking around in our arena. We have blacks, whites, Hispanics, Asians, millennials, people with physical handicaps. Everyone is just rallying around this team because they're playing team ball, they're acting as one unit, and they're inspiring us to hold hands and rise above our differences. So I certainly can see that sports can create a shift in local communities, depending on whether things are negative or positive. It really can create a shift, but I think winning also helps.
Yeah. It's the winning piece is quite interesting, and maybe Craig, you and I talked about this. So there's a fantastic, at least brand, if not baseball team here in Chicago called the Cubs. And anyway, the owner of the relatively new owner of the Cubs, Tom Ricketts, sort of sets out to actually make this team win, or wants to build a team that can win. But I think one of the interesting stories is that the brand has changed because they could always fill Wrigley Field, and you pay your money, and people really went to drink and have a nice party and whatever. And they never, ever expected the team to win, so they were happy to part with their money for the fun. The minute the brand changed and said, no, we want to win, and then they weren't winning, people go, oh, this doesn't seem like a good deal, and ticket sales have gone down. So maybe it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Chris, on the sort of sense of the community, I know you do a lot of work in education and with schools, so at a very kind of almost atomic level of a community. How do you see that kind of influencing very local communities in what you do with the work and the foundation with schools?
How do so the community to me is something that's really interesting, and I think that because we as individuals, I mean, sometimes it's really easy to think of ourselves as individuals and what is in it for me. And the community part of it really is this idea of kind of what I do for my community is what I do for myself. And I think going to the schools for us, we have an educational program with my nonprofit called Name Tags that looks at the labels that we put on ourselves and others, which are often our limitations. I can't do this because ... And we're really good at filling in that ... So it's about resilience, this idea of it's not what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens to you. It's also about finding your unique voice, and then about building a community. And which is, I find really cool with the kids, is that kids so often are told what to do. And what we try to do is flip that switch for them and say, you're responsible for building a community that's going to allow you to succeed, that's going to allow you to take a risk. And the other side of building that community, I think, is that when you go in and when you go into a community and do something for people's children, it's really easy to get people on your side. But the community, to me, is trying to look beyond ourselves and trying to look beyond, and is really speaking to this whole people, planet, and profit as well, isn't it? That we are stewards, and partially because we're individually involved in it as well. It is us. It's not that we're doing something for something else. We're doing it because it is us, and it's this representation of us.
Yeah. It certainly is has this ability to sort of transcend many dimensions of all of our lives and communities and everything. It sort of shows up as almost insidious in terms of how it gets into us. Thinking a little bit about the future, and Kin is always about looking to the future. In fact, every one of Rob's emails always finishes to the future, which is great. The one person I can guarantee you'll probably never get at the Atlanta Hawks games is Rob Walcott, but that's thinking about the future, cast your minds ahead, 10, 15 years, where do you see sport from the perspective of your worlds? What's changed, what's the same, what's different, how is it changing the world? Craig, from your perspective?
Well, I would say a couple different things. First is that I don't know how many of you in here have put on Oculus Rift or Next VR or heard of or seen the Magic Leap demo, but there's technology coming now that actually puts you in the eyes and the mind frame and the emotions of athletes. And I think if you appreciate it now, and if you can sit on a couch and watch an HD TV or a 4K TV if you have that level of resolution, and think that sport looks pretty amazing, I think it's going to be absolutely mind-blowing to see what it looks like in 10 years when we can actually feel it. And I feel like you can connect with people now through passion and through emotion and through what you see through a TV. But when you're seeing it firsthand and you're feeling it and you know what that looks like, I mean, people are wearing GoPros more and more every day and showing you, the nuances of what it takes to be an athlete. So I think that we'll be more emotional about sports in the future, and it'll bridge the gap between the athlete and the fans. And, as someone that works in digital, that's what all we ever ask for. There's a company, I won't tell you who the company is, but there's a company out there that does instant replays for almost everything that you've ever seen in sports, whether it's FIFA World Cup, Olympics, NBC, CBS. There's 25 instant replay camera angles for every single thing that happens on the field. But you only see 3 of those because that's what NBC pays for, right? And you see those between a play. So I asked a simple question: what do you do with those 22 other replays? Because I'm sure that fans in all different channels would like to see what just happened. Wow. So I hope there's a day that we get more content that we can engage with and we can feel the emotion of what it's like to be a professional athlete.
Wow. So I can see England lose from 25 different directions.
Yeah.
Fantastic. We won't mention that they beat where is Peter Bryant on that. Nzinga, from your perspective?
I think about it from an internal operations perspective. So who are the people running sports organizations? How are decisions from the top being made? And what does it look like 10 years out? I mean, 10 years out in an ideal world for me, I see women running organizations. I see people of color having prominent positions and impacting what happens on the field. I see a variety of perspectives brought to the table that are not currently brought to the table. So thinking about the way that we recruit talent in sports organizations. Currently, we generally poach from other teams or other leagues. That's how we, you have to know sports to get into sports. And I want to see it in a different way. I want us to, look at this room of intelligent people that come from a variety of perspectives and backgrounds. If you could really just take all of the knowledge in this room and put a problem in front of a group like this to solve, you'd be surprised what you could come up with, and you can apply it to sports. So really thinking about the way that we look at talent, how we engage with talent, and keeping an open mind. We should see women referees on the field. I mean, we should start to think about the game very differently than we do now, and I think we will in a decade.
It's fantastic. Chris?
The future, actually, Craig, as you were talking, I was wondering, it was kind of interesting, as you were talking about the slow-mo and the various angles, I was wondering, do you think that could possibly end up coming first from like a video game? I mean, like you get these video games where you see all these angles and then suddenly we realize that that's actually a possibility, which is pretty amazing what's coming out of some of those things. And you get so many different media that are telling the story, and ultimately, to me, that's the beauty of sport, is it is about the story. It really is. I mean, before the writers' strike, the SAG writers' strike, it was the original reality television, wasn't it? It was sport. And I think that's, I think that in some ways it's going to be different, but hopefully it's going to be the same as well, that the essence of sport, it's like the 12-step program. I'm a baseball fan. Just have to admit that first off. But there's that moment in each game. I mean, it's the one-on-one moment. And I think to Craig's point that hopefully we can see a little bit more of what that moment means and what that moment means to the individual, because sometimes television flattens it out. As a ski racer, I was disappointed in some ways where I'm like, I know just how brutal and how steep this is, but it looks like your regular intermediate run on television. And you think, no, this is really hard. You guys have no idea. It's really hard.
You need his new kind of feel it vision thing. Yeah.
It really is. is, and to be able to tell that story and to be able to see. So I agree 100% with you. And from my viewpoint on the Paralympic side, I think that story is the story of viability of a 1.1 billion people who in some ways are sort of forgotten, but are representative of who we are and what the human experience is.
You watching the shot clock?
What's that? I'm watching the shot clock
better shoot the
because
ball.
we're going to shoot the ball. We could, of course, like always, go on, but I think that some of the messages here, the fact it starts always with the athlete and the story is a great way to think about the core of what sport is there. But when Craig talks about the digital revolution and the ability to take what we do locally, it struck me that it was just the same as the conversation about the 1871 team. It's about local, but everything is global. I think the fact that we're going to be able to get people much more involved in things, the digital world and sort of almost field sport, probably underlies the power of sport to continue to change the world and maybe doubles down the importance of sport thinking of itself as a bigger influencer and a bigger agent of change. And Nzinga, the whole sense that diversity and leadership and bringing from the top to the bottom, the front of house, the back of house, on field, to be much more reflective of the world around us, I think is a crucial journey. And I loved where you started with the conversation about Pepsi. And it's only in those moments when it's those insights of the blindingly obvious that we all go, wow, how did we not see that? And I think sport enables us to do that. Please join me in thanking three marvelous panelists.
And I add my thanks. Kevin and Craig created this panel. And it's really exciting when you get people who know what they're doing, have the insight and the humor to put something together that is really beautiful and brings us a new world.
Rob, can
Nzinga, Craig, quick.
I just wanted to, for those of you that didn't know, we had two kin challenges around sport, one for the Atlanta Hawks and one for the Golden State Warriors, and they were all around sort of innovation and activating locally. They were phenomenal, and one thing to know about the world of sports is it's very fluid. So just because they didn't win doesn't mean that the ideas aren't still actively in play with both of those teams. So I wanted to thank my teams wherever they are out there. Thank you guys very much.
Great. Thanks for that, Craig. Nzinga, diversity in sports. 2015, it's about time. You know, when diversity impacts the bottom line, people start to pay attention. But you know, Phil Kotler was talking about reputation earlier, and how do we get organizations to figure this stuff out before they get slapped in the face? So that's going to be exciting to see the evolution over that decade you talked about. Chris, you're talking about telling stories. You were telling a story. At one point you said, yes, I know. And it caused me to think about, what do I know? I'm not sure. Or even better question, what am I trying to find? What don't I know that I need to? Great stories, Chris. Thanks. And then Craig, you said, I love sports and technology. Craig's going to join me on a panel later for undergrads here at Northwestern. They're dying to figure out, what do I do with my life? And what we're going to tell them is, we really have no idea. But he said, I love sports and technology. I want you to take this tool. It's a simple tool. Write it down. Actually, write it down and put blanks. Don't write it down. Write down the I love blank and blank. Don't write the blanks in. Just write blanks. Write blanks. And then think hard about it and then write two things that you love. And see if you can figure out how to do those two things together. Man, that's exciting. And Kevin, you're a Kinnian through and through. I love your knowledge and your humor, your corporate background, your sports background, your just general curiosity. And it's great to have you in the game here. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.